Welcome to the Holy Post. A Texas megachurch is facing criticism after a viral TikTok video showed a rehearsal of its Christmas production with drummers flying over the crowd on wires. Is this the right way to celebrate the birth of a humble savior? Then new data says Americans are far more isolated and lonely than ever before, and it's not because of COVID. Could the church be the solution, or is it just part of the problem? And a researcher offers 3 surprising explanations for why the decline of religion in the U.S. didn't start until the 1990s. Then Old Testament scholar Carmen Imes answers questions about the book of Exodus. Here is episode 539. Hey everyone, welcome to the Holy Post. This is Sky. I am not Phil. Phil informed us via Slack channel earlier today that he has been sick over the weekend and has no voice. And I feel bad because it's been going around. It's been really bad. You might remember a couple weeks ago, I was the sick one, although I still made it onto the show. I pushed through. Right?
Oh, don't do that. That's not nice.
I'm just joking. I am joined by Caitlin Chess. It's just the two of us today.
It's fun.
You think this is going to work?
I mean, we have some experience doing this.
We do, because we regularly record Getting Schooled with Caitlin, or by Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess, which is that special show we do just for our Patreon supporters. So Caitlin and I have some rapport. We can do this.
Yeah, totally.
Phil gave us some stories. We found some other stories. We got stuff to talk about. We've got a great guest. It's going to be a good show. It's the holiday season. You can think of Phil as like the baby Jesus who's not quite here yet.
Oh, no.
And we're just waiting for his arrival, and Advent is full of that anticipation. So next week when he's back, we can all celebrate his return.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Oh, gosh. Sky, can I tell you, there's this really horrendous holiday Christmassy decoration at the Divinity School at Duke that, have you seen those like Santa, where like Santa's like kneeling in front of a manger?
Yes.
There's an empty manger, I assume because we're waiting for Jesus to come at Christmas, and a full life-size, like animatronic at Disney kind of life-size Santa kneeling in front of the manger. Just like in full display in the Divinity School. It's the scariest thing I've ever seen.
Like it's an official school exhibit?
Apparently all the departments have a competition to decorate different parts of the school. I don't know what department chose this, but it is horrifying.
Okay, well.
Yeah, just fun fact.
With that image in your mind, here's the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin.
Okay, speaking of Christmas productions and arrangements, there's a story that's been going around. It was a big TikTok thing. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. This headline is coming from the Houston Chronicle. Texas megachurch responds to backlash over opulent Christmas show. Caitlin, do you want to describe the TikTok video?
Yes. So you just see what looks like a normal megachurch service. You might go, oh, yes, I'm familiar with these kinds of things. You can tell there's Christmassy stuff happening. And then a man is being suspended from the ceiling, standing. It's not, I mean, he's kind of standing, suspended from the ceiling, drumming and being kind of like carried over the people in the audience.
Right. So here's how the Texas Chronicle describes it. A Texas megachurch is facing backlash online after a TikTok showing its extravagant setup for an upcoming Christmas performance went viral. The footage appears to show performers at Prestonwood Baptist Church rehearsing the church's annual Christmas show inside its 7,000-person capacity Plano, Texas facility. In the video, several men dressed in black are suspended by cables dozens of feet off the ground near the ceiling of the church's cavernous worship facility. The men glide through the air as they play a snare drum cadence in unison while suspension cables move up and down tracks attached to the ceiling. An enormous screen positioned behind the church's stage displays the word Jesus in all capital white letters while blue and purple lights flash in the background. That's beautiful.
I forgot about that. That is. You want to know another fun fact? I graduated from seminary in that sanctuary.
Really? That's where Dallas held its...
Yeah, there were no flying drummers, unfortunately, but...
It'd be great if they were dressed like monkeys, wouldn't it?
Why?
Flying drumming monkeys. It's like a whole...
Classic Christmas.
Like a Wicked Wizard of Oz crossover thing. Okay, so Prestonwood Baptist Church has responded to the critique. And let me read the response. This is an official release to the Houston Chronicle. For more than a quarter of a century, Prestonwood Baptist Church has pulled out all the stops in celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ during the Christmas season. We are grateful to have the opportunity to share this grand celebration of our Savior with as many as 75,000 people each year through the gift of Christmas. That's in quotes. I assume that's the title of the program. We believe Jesus deserves our absolute best, especially at Christmas. It's unfortunate that the perennial American tradition of the church Christmas program now draws hateful ire from some. We pray that they too may come to know the joy of Christmas and the love of our Savior.
I just can't imagine describing what I saw as the perennial tradition of the Christmas pageant. Like, that is not the, like...
I think they were putting the emphasis on Jesus deserves our very best.
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And that's apparently
Sure.
Flying Drummers is the best.
Is our best. That's our best.
Okay, so here's the grand question that we need. I mean, okay, taking a step back, most of us would say Flying Drummers in a megachurch is pretty extravagant.
Yeah.
And yet, you're going to Rwanda next week.
I am. Mm-hmm.
Okay, a Central African country. I'm sure they have some larger churches. They probably have smaller churches. It's a very Christian country. Mm-hmm. I'm sure if they were to visit most of our not mega churches in the United States and our Christmas pageants, they would also think that's pretty elaborate. Like,
That's true.
they've got projectors and lights and all these things. So elaborate or extravagant is a relative term.
That's true.
So here's my question, Caitlin. Is what Prestonwood Baptist Church is doing wrong?
I don't know. I don't know about wrong. I do think it's interesting. I even have been, I'm going to be in Rwanda for Christmas, and I haven't been there yet, so I can't really speak to it. But what I have been told is Christmas is just not a big deal. And I think it's interesting that it is true that Christians throughout history and around the world, while we have always celebrated Christmas in some sense, we've always marked the birth of Jesus as an important thing to remember and to celebrate and to worship God in response to that event. We have not always made it such a big commercial production as we have in the US. We haven't even always made it. I mean, it is such a bigger deal in the US than even Easter, which was not been true historically, right, and isn't true in all countries. And so I do think, while you're right that someone from another context could come into any church and see a Christmas pageant and think like, wow, you spent money on costumes to put on a little play, However, lots of churches and lots of places around the world have had artistic, representations of Christ, and especially of the Nativity in different contexts with different mediums. And so the idea that you would spend money creating something beautiful about it is not strange. I do think even people in the U.S. who live in different parts of the U.S. would look at the extravagance of a production like that and think that it is a little much. And I'm curious, Sky, from you, like, having written about the church and being a pastor in the past and all of that, how do you, my initial response to this is to think the priorities of a place that puts a lot of effort into that kind of production is off. The priorities are not right. But maybe I'm wrong. Like, do you think it's possible to do that kind of thing and not have something out of whack when it comes to what you think church is and is for?
Yeah. Okay. Before I answer that, I'll tell you what this reminded me of. A couple of years ago, there was some meme going around the internet that showed this very beautiful, ornate, elaborate Roman Catholic cathedral, like the kinds you see in Europe that are just awe-inspiring. Beautiful, awe-inspiring. And it showed a bunch of cardinals or bishops or somebody in their robes and, again, very elaborately dressed. And the meme said basically something like, Christianity, you're doing it wrong. And the argument of the article that accompanied it was, Jesus cared about the poor. We're commanded to care for the poor. Right. And seeing these beautiful, expensive cathedrals and opulent robes and things like that was they're arguing is the inverse of what Jesus stood for. Anyway, I saw that a couple of years ago, and part of me, I'm obviously not Roman Catholic, but part of me got kind of defensive.
No.
Like, we need those cathedrals, and we need these beautiful kind of icons and art and all that. I'm thinking of the Vatican and some of the, and yet when I see the megachurch in Dallas, I'm going, yeah, that's terrible. And I wonder if it's just because Roman Catholicism's not my tradition. So I give them more slack, whereas my tradition is probably closer to the megachurch in Dallas, and I'm like, ooh, kind of embarrassed by it. So there's obviously a lot of cultural stuff going on here.
Yeah.
But here's the part I'm struggling with. Around the same time that this TikTok thing was going around of the suspended drummers, I listened to an episode of the Voxology podcast, Mike Erie's show. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you listen to that regularly, Caitlin, but he did a show about 1 Peter 2 and the whole text about, not letting women speak and have authority over a man and all that. And he's giving cultural context for that. And it seems unrelated. But one of the things he really drove home...
Tell me how it is.
Tell me how this is related. One of the things Mike said that was super helpful, and it's not just unique to that text, is that Paul's emphasis very much throughout the letter to Timothy is making sure that the church's reputation with outsiders is good. Right? Like appoint leaders who have a good reputation with outsiders.
Yeah.
And he uses that to elaborate on the role of women in Ephesus and different things like that. And you see that also very strongly in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where he's worried about speaking in tongues and what are outsiders going to say about you and these other. So the principle that comes out of all this is Paul cares deeply about the church's reputation with outsiders and doesn't want the church doing things that's going to unnecessarily create barriers for those outside to want to come in and have a positive view of the Christians. On the flip side, when it comes to a gospel issue, Paul doesn't want the church to capitulate to what the culture wants. So again, in 1 Corinthians, he chastises them in chapter 11 for the way they're taking communion, because the rich and the poor were taking communion separately. And Paul basically says, no. Even though that's the way Corinthian culture does it, that is a clear violation of the gospel of Jesus. And you have to have rich and poor at the same table with one another, even though it's going to scandalize you with outsiders. Yeah. All that to say, I'm wondering, how does a Christmas production like this fit in that framework? Are we in Texas, does this actually build goodwill with outsiders, or does it create barriers with outsiders because it feels icky? Any thoughts?
Well, and I think the comparison that you made to like beautiful cathedrals is helpful in that, I was in Italy this last summer, spent all this time in these really beautiful places, was deeply moved by them, even though I am not Catholic, and in some ways felt very real. The difference, like the distance between my expression of faith and theirs felt real. But it seems like that's great because they're old and have wasted all this time and they're beautiful. The history of how they found the funds to build these cathedrals is icky in lots of ways. I mean, there's the story a lot of Protestants will tell about indulgences being used, and that's true. Yeah. But even outside of that, typically it was sort of a political thing. Like someone has a lot of money, they give it to the church, it gets the church's stamp of approval for them, they get some position of power, and then they get to build a cathedral. So even if it wasn't about indulgences or about some of the theological problems we have with that, the history of the cathedrals being built is usually pretty icky. And so I think the comparison is helpful in that we could look at the megachurch with the really extravagant performance and say, is that a good use of funds? And how is your church structured in such a way that you have access to those funds? And is that healthy and good? A very similar question could be asked about the construction of these beautiful things. To me, though, part of the difference, as you've described, is not just reputation with outsiders. It's also one of the good things about the building of these cathedrals. Yes, it was lots of people had bad motives for doing it. There was, though, a sense of we are doing something to bring glory to God, and we are building this lasting thing that maybe I work for 50 years of my life on this cathedral and I never get to benefit from it. That's for a generation after me. And it's hard to imagine an extravagant Christmas production in a megachurch in Texas coming from the place of, I am just worshiping God, and if I don't benefit from it at all, it brings no glory to me, that's fine, it's for the next generation. And I worry that so many of our expressions, our cultural expressions in churches, are just whatever the hot new thing is. Like we have this new technology where we can get a drummer up in the air, so we're going to do it. We have light shows, we have whatever, which is very different than the mindset you have to have if you're building something that will take you 100 years to build and will last for hundreds of years after that. And I think part of the reason that it feels so icky to people when they see that little thing on TikTok is not just because it's like a lot of money to make something beautiful. It's because it's not beautiful. It's like, it feels cheesy. It feels like it's kind of catering to like the worst aesthetic instincts of people, and I don't like that. And I think sometimes we're afraid to say that, and I think sometimes the instinct to be afraid to say that is good, to say, no, actually cheesy things can be good. Like, you know, telling a Bible story with felt, you know, people and doing kind of silly stuff in church is fine. But I think part of that instinct is good, is to say, like, if we are going to have extravagant use of resources to tell a beautiful story that we think is worth those resources, we should really care that it's good, not that it just caters to a big crowd of people and what they already like. We should actually have different standards for it than just that. And that feels like part of the difference to me. I don't know if that is part of what you're thinking. One
way of describing that is the cathedrals you might encounter in old world Europe feel like eternal monuments. They feel not transcendental, but transgenerational, right? They're these just awe-inspiring monuments. Whereas the productions we're looking at, like the ones on TikTok, feel just like consumer productions.
Yeah.
And there's something of a value difference in that. The other thing, speaking of generations, in their statement, they talk about how we believe Jesus deserves our absolute best. And that language just smells like boomer values to me, right? I encountered this a lot in megachurch world. Excellence. It's all about excellence. We care about excellence. It was very much a boomer thing. And it felt like when I was younger, my generation, the value was already shifting from excellence toward authenticity.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We didn't care so much about how perfect was the production. We cared about the realness and the transparency of. So you're a generation even younger than me. What values speak for, please, everybody in your generation, and what are the kind of values that you think are going to make a good impression with outsiders in the church, and which ones are going to perhaps make a bad impression?
That's a really good point, because I do think, part of the icky factor when people on TikTok see this is that it feels inauthentic, or I do actually think a lot of young people, like, they know when you think you're catering to their interests. Like, they know when you set up your youth group thinking that it would cater to them. And I think they actually don't. I mean, a lot of young people, this is true, not just specifically of millennials or of Gen Z. It's true, like, every generation. Like, young people tend to really care about justice. They tend to really care about not allowing social conventions to prevent us from doing the right thing. They can kind of want to rebel against, the way their parents did things. And so the idea that you would do something that is really it's very obviously just to try and get them in the door, like, that in and of itself, I think, feels icky to a lot of younger people. And also, to your point, like, I have been in conversations at churches that were fairly large and trying to get larger, and had access to a lot of populations of college students and seminary students, and tried to figure out how to get them in the doors. And I remember realizing that all the conversation was happening was with a generation or two above me, not asking what young people wanted or thought would be good, and assuming that it did boil down to, like, let's get great coffee, let's have contemporary worship, let's have better lights, and kind of let's have an environment that we feel like caters to what they want. And what I have seen over and over again is you can get all of that stuff somewhere else. Like, you can get an amazing Christmas show at a theater somewhere in your city. You can go and get great worship music online. You can get even to some of the interests that young people have today, you can work for social justice at a totally non-religious organization. You can find people committed to do that work with you. All of those things, to varying degrees, are important to the church. I would say social justice being much more important than, like, the aesthetics of whatever. But all of those things, you could argue, have some relationship to what the church does. And yet sometimes I think we have forgotten that the real gift that we get, like, a true gift to the world, and that it is good news, is the story that Jesus Christ lived, died, and rose from the dead, and what that means for the status of creation. Like, the fact that he is returning to redeem all things and wipe every tear from every eye. That is the kind of thick, rich, theological claim that you truly cannot get by volunteering with some people who share your values, or by seeing a really cool Christmas production. And if you can do the really cool Christmas production and maintain the sense that the real gift we have to offer is not our quote unquote best in terms of our production value, the real gift we have to offer is these ridiculous claims of the gospel, I'm less worried about it. I just think that our emphasis on the production value often makes us think that that's the gift we have to give. And I don't think that's the gift that we have to give. And to your point, people can tell what we think is actually important. We're communicating our values by those kinds of productions. And people are sick of churches that seem to care more about those things than about, as you said, caring for the poor.
Well, I wonder about how this plays out regionally, because in Texas, it seems like they're not sick of it, right? There's still enough of an audience and an interest to get, what did they say, 75,000 people a year to these things, at least at that church. So there's definitely regional differences and value differences. And but I think we need to keep ourselves in check a little bit, because when we react viscerally to a TikTok video like that, we need to slow down a minute and go, okay, where may the log be in my eye?
Yeah.
And what is elaborate that I'm doing or we're doing in our community that would be judged differently by someone outside?
Totally.
I don't think it's necessarily fair to cast stones at Prestonwood Baptist, but I would hope anybody in any church leadership role would slow down enough to ask the kinds of questions you're asking. Right?
Yeah.
What are our values? Who are we trying to engage with this? What does it mean to have a good reputation with outsiders?
Yeah.
How do we define an outsider? Do we just mean a Christian in our community who's not attending our church, who's who we want? Or are we talking about non-believers? And what of real value do we have to offer here? And obviously that is the gospel. And how is that manifested? Is it manifested by hanging drummers from the ceiling? Or is there another way we ought to manifest that in our community?
Yeah.
And every church needs to answer that for themselves. Yeah. Okay, let's go on to another story. This is one that Phil wanted to talk about, and he's not here, so we're going to talk about it anyway. It's an article called "Americans Are Choosing to Be Alone," and it dives into some new research, which is partly disturbing but not entirely surprising. So following the COVID-19 pandemic, we have changed our social dynamics and how often we're getting together with people, which again is not entirely surprising, but it affected Thanksgiving too. So here's the article. Americans spent 38% less time with friends and relatives over the Thanksgiving weekend in the past 2 years than they had a decade prior. And here's the scarier news. Our social lives were withering dramatically before COVID-19. Between 2014 and 2019, time spent with friends went down by more than it did during the pandemic. According to the Census Bureau's American Time Use Survey, the amount of time the average American spent with friends was stable at about 6.5 hours per week between 2010 and 2013. Then, in 2014, time spent with friends began to decline. By 2019, the average American was spending only 4 hours per week with friends, a 37% decline from 5 years before. Again, that's pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
And then the COVID pandemic deepens this trend. During the pandemic, time with friends fell further. In 2021, the average American spent only 2 hours and 45 minutes a week with close friends, a 58% decline relative to 2010 to 2013. And here's the weird part. On average, Americans did not transfer that lost time to spouses, partners, or children. Instead, they chose to be alone. And then he goes on to say, no single group drives the trend. It's seen across all demographic groups, but the absolute decline among Americans ages 15 to 19 is staggering. Relative to 2010 to 2013, the average American teenager spent approximately 11 fewer hours with friends each week in 2021, a 64% decline, and 12 additional hours alone, a 48% increase. And the reason why that's so shocking is because of all age groups, teenagers spend the most time with friends. Yeah. And yet they're the group that declined the most, 64% decline, just since 2013. Can you guess what the culprit is, Caitlin?
Oh, does it say what the culprit is?
It does.
Oh, no, I don't know. The internet.
Well, okay, so here's the explanation. Social media, political polarization, and new technologies all played a role in the drop. It is notable that market penetration for smartphones crossed 50% in 2014. That was the year they started to see the massive decline. Yeah. So as smartphones became ubiquitous throughout America, people stopped engaging with friends. How do you see this? I mean, you've been in an academic environment with a lot of younger people for the last 10 years, roughly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don't remind my mom.
I mean, it seems like college, seminary, graduate school would be one of the most social environments you could possibly be. Do you recognize this trend?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, I was just talking to some friends last night. We were talking about how we actually think that that's part of what can drive some people to stay in grad school for longer, is the sense that if I was to graduate college, this period that I think a lot of people are nostalgic for college because it is a time when you're in a walkable area, you have your friends are around you all the time, your life is just involving more people than it would once you're graduated. And I think typically a lot of people then substitute that with they get married quickly after college, they have kids. Some of their emphasis for a few years is immediate family life, but very often if they're part of a church or part of a community where they have access to other young families, that's natural relationships that are harder to build when you don't have the shared, like, I have toddlers and I don't know what to do. And, a lot of people are not getting married as young and they're not having kids as young. And I think a lot of young people in my program were attracted to staying in grad school because it was the unique environment where, I on any day today went to the library to work with some people. I ran into multiple people that they're not coworkers and they don't live in my house with me. And I just naturally run into them. Whereas if I was working kind of a normal job, I am single, I live alone. I could go to work, maybe interact with coworkers, maybe not, but they're definitely not friends. They're coworkers, come home, be alone and go to sleep. And we don't live in worlds, like we don't live in neighborhoods, most of us, that are constructed to allow that kind of in-person interaction unless it has kind of functioned the way that it has in the past. And so I really think, I know people now in my own context that are starting to try to live with families if they're single, or trying to have multiple families live together, or trying to have kind of what we in America, not the rest of the world and not the rest of history, but in America in this moment, consider unusual living situations, because they recognize that the idea that we all just live in homes by ourselves, many of us living alone, and go to work and come home, and that's our life, is not a full human life. Like it makes sense that once you get accustomed to that and you have the access to the internet, and that kind of in some very distorted way fulfills that, but doesn't fully fulfill it, you will just have a really deeply lonely life. And I've heard Andy Crouch talk about this before, about the architecture, like what social architecture do we need? I think that the things that this article has, outlined as problems are very real problems. But I also think on a structural level, like you could lessen people's internet usage, you could lessen political polarization. But if we continue to live in little single family homes and are not within walking distance of other people, I don't know that fixing those problems would really fix some of the issue. We live in a world that no other kind of culture in the world has ever lived in terms of our limited access to other people, even intergenerationally in our families.
Yeah, to your point, this article goes on to say that 10 years ago, so roughly 2012, Americans spent the same amount of time with friends as Americans did in the 1960s and 70s.
Wow.
And so just in the last 10 years, we've seen this dramatic downturn. So not only do we live in a culture unlike others where we are very atomized and separated, but just the last 10 years, we've put that into overdrive. My oldest daughter just came back from a semester in Europe. She's been home a few days. We were up super late talking one night because she's halfway through her junior year of college. Yeah. So I've noticed this with other students when I've mentored them at Wheaton College here, like around this time, midway through their junior years, when they start to freak out. Because they know they're about 18 months away from graduating. And then it's exactly what you talked about. Like there's that anxiety about, I don't have this structure around me anymore. I remember being in that season, graduating from college, and I went to graduate school and I was engaged that year. Like I had things built into the structure of my life to keep me in community. And I'm generally an introvert. Like I don't need tons of people in my life to feel fulfilled. And even I went through this really difficult transition where you come out of the most intense community experience you could have as an undergrad in college, and suddenly that's changed. And it's a hard transition. Yeah. So part of my question is, with this generation and everyone being less social, is part of the problem that they think they're being social when they're on their phone? And they think that's an adequate substitution for actually incarnate relationships? Is that part of it? So they don't recognize the 64% drop in social activity?
Well, I also think, I think people are dissatisfied with it. Like, I really do think on some level, yes, you can trick yourself into thinking that you're okay because you have a lot of social interaction online. But I think the people that I talk to are not satisfied with the life that they have, the way that it is set up. I've been watching a TV show recently where there's this like young millennial, maybe actually, I mean, now Gen Z, she's probably right out of college, Gen Z character, who her whole description is just like, I thought life would be different than it is. Like, I'm just dissatisfied. And she's shown in the show constantly on her phone and constantly aware of how she's presented on social media. And I really think that that's an accurate description of a lot of people. They're not satisfied. I think the problem is partially that a lot of our social media, I mean, it does something to your brain chemistry, and it is really hard to get out of the patterns and habits that you're in. But I also think, like I said, I just think when we didn't have that, we had to work harder. And so we could overcome some of the barriers we've created in terms of, like I said, the architecture and just like the way we've built our lives. But now that we don't have the same impetus to get over that, we still have these barriers of just like, I can imagine the person fresh out of college, working a normal job, coming home, living alone, going to social media because that's the best they can get, and feeling like, what else do I do? Like, we in America don't have the same, you know, it's that classic thing about we don't have the bowling clubs anymore, or we don't have the kind of social organizations we used to have. Church attendance is down. Like, you just don't have opportunities to find ways to build relationships, not only friendships, which are important, but I think existing in the lives of like intergenerational families, of being a part of a larger community. I think that is like part of what the church historically has done that we really need to reclaim. And I really think part of what makes this hard is that most of our churches have learned, as we've talked about in the podcast a ton, have learned that part of how you appeal to people is really zeroing in on a demographic. So you provide something that the teenagers want, you provide something that the young parents want, you provide the children's ministry. And then what happens with all those kids is that they were catered to in elementary school and middle school and high school. They did a campus ministry in college. Now they're adults. Maybe they're not married. They don't fit into the young family group. And they don't have a thing that's catering to them anymore. So of course you're lonely, but we haven't set up our churches in such a way that that young person, through all of their growing up, and then especially once they don't kind of fit in those demographics anymore, just belongs to the whole life of the church, knows little kids, knows grandparent age people, is involved in greater ways than just the little demographic that they're in. But if we don't have that set up in our churches, of course, especially that straight out of college demographic is just going to feel like abandoned because nothing's for them anymore.
So that reminds me of conversations we've had on past episodes about digital church. Like, coming out of the pandemic, for legitimate reasons, there were quite a few people who couldn't engage in church in person. And so the video became an alternative. And there are some people still today, I want to acknowledge, who can't physically get to a church for various reasons. And there is a value in accommodating their engagement via video. But some churches are heavily relying on video as a complete alternative to incarnate church gatherings. And I just wonder if that's making this even worse, because we had Jay Kim on the show a few months ago talking about his book, Analog Church, and I think his prior book, Analog Christian. And just the value of incarnate, in-person church life. And like this article talks about how this isolation is causing troubling social trends. Isolation, worsening mental health, particularly among adolescents, rising aggressive behavior, violent crime. When people don't know other people, and if they don't know people who aren't like them, we don't build empathy. We don't build bonds of cooperation. We don't build good mental health. Like, all these are critical to just human flourishing. And I don't know how you have Christian discipleship and flourishing without these dynamics. So it seems like some churches, in their desperation to keep the tithing going and attendance up and some very narrowly defined effectiveness of the gospel, are putting all their resources into this digital engagement, but are they shooting themselves in the foot? If you were launching a church today, Caitlin, in this environment, how would you
No, absolutely not.
No, you wouldn't launch one, or no, you wouldn't go digital?
Well, I wouldn't launch one. I am not capable of doing that. I think you're exactly right in that we don't often enough recognize that the tools that we use shape us too. They're not neutral. And so if you have the option of podcasting your sermons, that doesn't always just stay an option. Like, it becomes what people want. And I really think, so if I was launching a church in an imaginary world, I would not have a digital option. And I think people would, people's response to that is usually, well, like, what about the people who need it?
Right.
what I would say is, I think sometimes we have used digital options as a crutch, as just like an easy answer, instead of saying, are there things that would cost us more in time and attention and money that could meet the needs of vulnerable people that we have not pursued because the cheaper, more effective option is just sticking the service online and saying that's done. And we've kind of checked that box. And I really do think some of this all stems from the persistent tendency in American evangelicalism in particular, in America in general, for us to think of humans as primarily brains on sticks. Like, I just receive information, and so I can listen to a podcast sermon and I can listen to some music on Spotify, and that's the same as a church service. Whereas historically, Christians have believed that it mattered that you kneeled for confession. It mattered that you received communion, and it was a physical thing that went into your body, that there was something...
It mattered that you could look up and see up the drummer's shorts.
Oh my gosh. I thought you were about to say it mattered that you could look up in a cathedral and feel the smallness of yourself in the awe of God, which is true, not the shorts. Mm-hmm. But it's just, there are very good things we can do with digital options, with the internet, with our ability to record. There's great things we can do. We're doing that right now. But if we're doing that because we have a wrong anthropology, we have a wrong sense of what kind of creatures humans are and what we need to flourish, we will fail. We will use it for things it shouldn't be used for. We will use it too much. We will use it in the wrong ways. And I think that's why I love this loneliness article, in the sense that I do think this is one of those things where this confirms what Christians have always said about humans, that we need each other in embodied community, that the incarnation says something about God's love for us, but it also says something about humans and what we need and how we function best. And that should be at the forefront of how we make decisions about churches, which kind of goes back to our earlier thing about the drummer in the shorts, which is to say we can do lots of like shiny, beautiful things. But if we don't really have a sense of what kind of creatures humans are and how the gospel interacts with our needs, we will make mistakes. Because yes, that's a really beautiful production, but even that sort of ignores like the deep fundamental need that a human has to be known by someone else and loved by someone else in community. And hopefully, I hope that churches that put on really amazing productions follow up, and so someone has an opportunity to be in that kind of community. But too often when we have those kinds of resources to make the really sparkly, beautiful production, we think that we've done our best that we can do, when maybe our best really is like 5 people in a room eating a meal together, and that's what we've historically done.
I think this is so interesting to me. We're going to talk about one more story before we wrap up here, having to do with why people are leaving the church and not engaging it. But, you hear this, I'm sure. I hear it all the time from people, church leaders, who are just twisted in knots about why are people leaving the church, and why isn't the church having a greater impact on American culture and society, and why are all these, nuns happening, blah, blah, blah. It's everywhere. And yet articles like this and a bunch of others, and just anecdotal stuff that you and I are all hearing from young people and seeing, like, the whole culture is screaming about how desperate they are for incarnate, meaningful connection and relationship. That is the culture's great need right now, as we are caught in this digital vortex of devices and screens. Yeah. And here's a moment where the world's great need is immediately met by the church's mission.
Yes.
Like, the church has always been an incarnate community that is trying to foster real connection between one another and God. And at that moment, when the church could be the answer, so many are going, no, we want to go digital. No, we want to be more disincarnate. No, we want to have more multi-site screens and da. And I'm not saying they're all doing that, but it feels like there's such an opportunity here. And I don't know if a lot of the church is positioned to monopolize on it. I mean, it sounds kind of crass, but there is a real opportunity here for church communities to be what our culture needs right now, this digital oasis for incarnate engagement. And wow, if we miss this window, we have to be really foolish.
That is not scalable.
No, it's not.
It's not programmable. It's not something that we could kind of shuffle out as a church growth strategy. And that makes it hard to market, when that's kind of the point. But
okay, last story we're going to look at is, I think, kind of interesting, if I can find it. Here it is. Okay. Why Americans are leaving their churches. We've had like 1,000 of these articles.
The question everyone is asking.
Right. So there's a sociologist named Stephen Bullivant, I believe is how you say his name.
That was a good Phil moment.
What?
Not knowing how to pronounce someone's name.
Well, it's a written article. It's not.
That's good. I'm just saying you're fulfilling your role here.
Okay. Anyway, he's British, and he's written a new book called Nonverts, Nonverts, The Making of Ex-Christian America. It's come out from Oxford University Press. He says a third of Americans now claim no religious affiliation, and he has some ideas about why. And this is where it gets interesting. Bullivant wanted to know why Americans, once considered the exception to the secularization that has happened in Europe and elsewhere, are suddenly losing their religion. And there's this great chart that shows about 7% roughly of Americans were non-religious going all the way back to the 1960s. Like, it's been very consistently around 7%. And then in 1992, you start seeing the line go up, and it's just been on an uptrend ever since. So the last 30 years. And Stephen, what did I say his name was?
Bullivant?
Mm-hmm. He says this: there's a story about why there's this rise of the nuns, but to me, the more interesting story is why it didn't happen earlier. Why did this change start not in the 1960s, when American culture was in a state of upheaval, but in the 1990s? So the popular explanation is politics. That in the 1990s, you see the GOP take control of Congress for the first time in 1994. Newt Gingrich took over. You saw like this hyper-partisanship begin to take root. And some people want to say that America started getting more secular as a backlash to the religious right. And Bullivant says, there may be some factor that's political, but he kind of dismisses it as the primary factor. And instead he lists three others that are more important. Number one, the Cold War ended. And you know me, I'm a sucker for all things Cold War.
Yeah. I feel like we've talked about that a lot. Yeah.
Love, all the intrigue of spies and all that stuff. But anyway, so the Cold War ends. He says, around that time, the Cold War ends, and you have people are willing to admit to being non-religious. He said, in fact, by the time the new atheists rise up in the mid-2000s, it's no longer people with no religion who are the existential threat, but people with too much religion, especially extremist religion. The new atheism is really interesting in how it positions itself as patriotic. So his argument is that during the Cold War, to say you're non-religious, people would assume, well, then you're a communist. You're an enemy of our culture. You're an enemy. You must be with the Reds. Yeah. And so people would say, well, I'm a believer, or I go to church or whatever, because you wanted to associate patriotically with your country. Yeah. Once the Cold War is over and those categories no longer apply, you see this rise of people willing to go, actually, I'm not a believer, and it doesn't make me un-American or unpatriotic. Yeah. Second factor, and then we'll kind of unpack this, he says, is the sudden appearance of the internet. If you were brought up in small-town Kansas, you probably weren't going to find other people who are having religious doubts. The internet opened up those spaces for people to play around with ideas, hang out with other people, and get really deep into various subcultures. So you could find one another. And he dove especially into Mormon cultures and noticed that there was a dramatic rise of people leaving the Mormon faith. And he points out that Mormons are kind of the canary in the coal mine, because Mormon culture is so good at forming its members to be cohesive that when they start hiving off because of the internet, they're able to find other ex-Mormons. It's a sign that all these other religious communities are in trouble. The internet, he says, breaks down religious subculture. And then finally, the third reason he offers is circular logic. He said the nuns are rising because the nuns are rising. Human beings are herd creatures. We tend to do what our neighbors are doing. And so with every headline that heralds the seismic shift the nation is experiencing, more people are comfortable becoming non-religious. So the more people are non-religious, the more other people are willing to be non-religious. And it just becomes a snowball. Last thing that's interesting is this guy, Bullivant, is 38 years old, and he's from a non-religious family. But as a young adult, found himself converting to Catholicism. Yeah. So he went the other way. Yep. He says, it's so strange. I do a lot of work on people leaving Catholicism. For every person in Britain who is raised non-religious who becomes Christian, there's something like 26 people who go the other way. So he's personally the opposite of the trend he's talking about. So what stands out to you about those three explanations, the Cold War, the internet, and just the snowball of non-believers generating more non-believers.
I mean, we've talked about this before, but it is interesting that most of these trends are basically about social acceptability. Like, how much pressure is there socially to be involved in church or not? And I do think there's good reason for us to say it's fine if social acceptability changes. I mean, the fact that we had large numbers of church attendance in the past doesn't necessarily correlate with numbers of believers, doesn't necessarily correlate with faithfulness. Like, we have no real way of knowing how those kinds of trends are going. The other thing that's interesting to me, though, is this ability for the internet to kind of break down small social circles in person. There's a real gift to that. And I want to be clear in saying that lots of people have found great community and solidarity with people who have faced religious trauma, for people who are deconstructing, or whatever language they want to use for that, have found people online that they couldn't have found in person. The problem is sometimes we don't recognize that those same dynamics of like little social groups that are very insular also happens online, and in fact can happen to much greater degrees online, because there are algorithms and other kind of incentive structures for social media companies to keep you in your little bubble. And I really do fear that we have not been attentive enough to that, and instead have kind of seen the place that we came from, the little city that we're in, the church that we're in, the community we're in, that is suffocating and insular. And if I go online, I will find all the freedom and I can read everything I want and meet other people. And I do think we have to reckon with the reality that that's just not a true story of how the internet works, and be really cautious, not out of a desperate attempt to like keep people in the church, but out of a real concern for both the health of individual people, that I don't think you're a healthier person if you're in a little insular community, whether that's online or in person. And for the health of as we've talked about, like the health of American democracy, for us to be in communities in real life that people are very different from us. Maybe your little church is not that. Like, maybe you really are only hearing an echo chamber in your little church, but it is unlikely that the internet solves that problem. There are way other bigger structural things that are preventing your little church from being that diverse community. And you're not going to find the solution to that online. It's going to take much harder in-person work to kind of really be in an environment where you're learning from different people. The internet can help that in certain ways, but I do think, as we've talked about, we've just kind of enthusiastically said, like, yes, this is the panacea. This is the solution. This is the magic that will like fix all of the problems. And instead it replicates so many of them.
I'm glad you're saying that, because I've heard when I used to travel more and speak at colleges, Christian colleges, and interact with young people, one of the things I would hear quite frequently from young people is, I grew up in such a bubble.
Right.
And I need to get out of that bubble. And it's bubble this, bubble that. And that's true for many people. It's just a fact of life. When you're young, your world tends to be smaller. And as you get older, you see beyond that. But very few of them are willing to acknowledge that maybe you've just exchanged one bubble for another.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're not actually engaging in the grand diversity of the world that you think you are. You've just got this other little algorithmically built subculture that feels like a reaction to the previous one. And so you feel like you're growing and expanding, but in reality, you're just confined to another small space. Here's the other thing I wanted to unpack from this research. It's sort of implied by what he says about the Cold War thing. The inverse of people walking away from religion with the end of the Cold War is that maybe a lot of people were identifying as Christian because of the Cold War. In other words, they were differentiating themselves from their enemy, right? I am not a communist, therefore I'm a Christian.
Right.
And it made me wonder, is this why we continue to see conservative evangelicalism in America constantly on the hunt for a new enemy, right? Whether it's militant Islam, or it's the LGBT movement, or it's liberals in general, it's progressive. Like, we need that enemy because 20th century evangelicalism in a large way was defined by its enemy, defined by communism. And we don't know how to really form disciples and form community apart from being against someone.
Yes.
Is that, so you're agreeing with me?
Well, fear is an incredibly powerful tool. And yet we have not taken seriously that Jesus says over and over and over again, do not fear. So if we are using a tool that Jesus told us not to use, we should be deeply concerned with the kinds of communities that we will build with that kind of tool. And it it doesn't mean it's not powerful. Like it really is. That's what we see with political advertising. We see it in churches. We see it in our community. Fear is powerful. It, like, even just in terms of our brain chemistry, we now know that if you can be convinced that there is some kind of threat, even if it's not physically in front of you, many of the same chemicals are happening in your brain as if a physical threat was in front of you. So it is powerful. You can convince people to stay with you, to do things for you, to vote the way you want them to vote, to go to the church you want them to go to, if you can make them afraid. Which makes it so striking. Like, it should be the church that says we have every resource, both because of the literal words of Jesus of do not be afraid, but also because of the story of promised redemption that is coming. We should be the people that say we have reason not to fear. Even these numbers that are kind of scary. I can understand people in ministry and people who just genuinely care for the souls of other people. These numbers are scary. And it would be easy to say, let's use this as the new tool of fear. Look at declining numbers in the church. We can justify doing anything because of those declining numbers.
We are hearing that, though.
Yeah,
we are hearing people
time.
going, America's becoming post-Christian and we have to fight back and we need to, Christianize the culture and get people voted in who are Christians and school boards. And it's all this culture war.
Yep.
The fear of secularism, the fear of progressivism is a massively driving force today. But I'm just curious, like, what would it look like to have a Christian community, a church, a media platform, whatever, that does not build its following based on fear, but holding up a positive vision of life with God and life within a pluralistic culture as a follower of Christ. Like, that positive vision feels so much more attractive and compelling to me, even though it's going to be harder to build that audience or following or membership, doing it that way rather than scaring people and being like, well, you don't want your kids to grow up like that, so you should be a part of our church.
Well, and we've kind of thought that the positive vision we had to offer wasn't a great vision. Like, you're going to result to fear if you think the positive part of Christianity is going to heaven when you die. Like, that's not that great. So maybe fear is the better option. But if the story is Christ is returning to redeem all things, to put us in right community with each other and with him, to wipe every tear from every eye, for us to have the opportunity to do meaningful work in community together without the hindrances of sin, to worship God forever as a genuinely good thing that is the right end of how we were created. That will fit. If everything feels like the work you're doing is futile, you don't fit right in the community you're in, like that story of eternity with God and with God's people in which you belong and are doing work that is meaningful to you in community that loves you, that, like, people do desperately want that. If that was the vision that we were more often describing, then that would be a better way to get people involved than fear. But if all you have is a really small, watered down gospel of making sure you get a get out of hell free card, then fear is a better tool than that, because that's not a very good story to sell.
Well, coming soon, Caitlin's Christian community, not built on fear.
No.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of the Holy Post without Phil Vischer. We long and await his arrival, which will be heralded by angels and stars and farm animals. Actually, it'll probably be heralded more by vegetables and puppets, but he'll be back. Hope he gets well soon. We have an interview coming up. We will be introducing that. Thank you guys for your support. Make sure you check out the latest episodes of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess, where she talks about Mary. And we have another one coming up where you unpack liberation theology. I got my copy of James Cone's book, by the way.
Oh, good.
So I'll be reading that soon. And we have new episodes of Christian Asks as well. So lots of great stuff on Patreon for everybody. And make sure you order any Holy Post merchandise for your loved ones. And you can regale them with News of the Butt stickers. And come on, Caitlin. You need to send us your mom's address so we can give her some free merch.
She does have, her and my dad both have Holy Post shirts that they do wear.
Okay, well, she needs a News of the Butt sticker.
Okay.
We can put it on the back of her car. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us. We will see you next week.
The Holy Post podcast is supported by listeners like you. This episode is also sponsored by Faithful Counseling. If you grew up a conservative Christian like I did, you might have picked up some suspicion of counseling. Isn't prayer all we need, plus a Bible verse or two, preferably cross-stitched and hung on the living room wall? Prayer is fantastic, and cross-stitching is a very relaxing hobby, but I've found the listening ear of a trained counselor extremely helpful when life throws me a curveball, and that's where Faithful Counseling comes in. Faithful Counseling is committed to helping find a therapist that works for you. It's easy and free to change counselors until you find the right fit. Plus, it's more affordable than traditional in-office counseling, and financial aid is available. So keep cross-stitching and keep praying, but also take advantage of a trained Christian professional counselor by visiting faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. They've even got a special offer for Holy Post listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode. This episode is also supported by Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. That's 2 Timothy 2:15, and it was the theme verse of the Bible club I was in as a kid. Christians always say they take the Bible seriously, yet YouTube videos of pastors using the Bible to teach that man buns are sinful or that hating our enemies is fine if they're Marxists remind us we'd all be better off if we spent more time learning the Bible before we tried teaching it. And that's where Biola University's Talbot School of Theology can help. Learn the Bible for reals with Talbot's online programs. Talbot is a nationally recognized seminary with an outstanding faculty that can help you learn the Bible wherever you are on your schedule. Invest some time in taking the Bible seriously. Learn more about Talbot's online programs at biola.edu/Talbot. That's biola.edu/TALBOT. And now, back to the show.
I love when we have Bible scholars on the Holy Post because it's an opportunity for me to ask my questions about the Bible. And today we have a great one. Carmen Imes is a professor of Old Testament at Biola University. She wrote her dissertation on the command to not take Yahweh's name in vain from Exodus chapter 20, and we talk about that in today's conversation. Dr. Imes is also partnering with our friends at the BibleProject to offer a 14-hour video course through the book of Exodus, and it's completely free. We're going to link to that course in the show notes. We really encourage you to check it out. It's a great way to better understand this critically important Old Testament book. As we talk about in our conversation, if you don't understand the book of Exodus, you're going to miss a whole lot of the rest of the Bible, including the New Testament. Okay, here is my conversation with Dr. Carmen Imes. Dr. Carmen Imes, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm delighted because it's been a while since we've had a Bible scholar on just to kind of do Bible geek stuff, and I'm really looking forward to this. You are currently providing an in-depth study, a video study of the book of Exodus with the BibleProject guys. Is this the first time you've done something like that with them?
Yes, I was actually the first person they ever had come do a class, aside from Tim Mackey. So just today, Lucy Pepiat released a course on 1 Corinthians. She and I are the first ones to record. So we're thrilled. We're both thrilled that we got to do this.
Oh, I'm excited to hear that she's doing it too, because I've been indebted to her understanding of that book and love to have her on as well. But today we're going to talk about Exodus, which you are an Old Testament scholar. This is arguably one of the most important narratives for understanding the entire Bible. Explain why Exodus is so central to everything else, both in the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah. Exodus is really the story of God's making Israel as a people. The deliverance from Egypt is what we usually think about, like God's bringing liberation to the people. But actually, he's not freeing them for the sake of freedom. He's freeing them to become his people and to serve him. And so it's not just the coming out of slavery, but it's coming into the service of God and becoming his people who will represent him among the nations. So it's really, for the rest of the Bible, it's the moment that Israel looks back on as the moment when they became God's people, and they can't define themselves without reference to this historic event. So it's an exciting book, not just like because, wow, look, God cares about the oppressed, but because this is like the defining moment of who they are.
And then that gets picked up in the Gospels because Jesus and his apostles reference the Exodus over and over and over again. The Passover is critical for understanding the Last Supper. Jesus frames
is.
his own crucifixion and resurrection in terms of exodus and deliverance and salvation. So
Yes.
all of those themes find their origin in this story. So if we don't get this one
They
right,
do. Yeah,
we're likely to misunderstand all the others.
we are.
Okay, so in some of the promotional videos you guys created for the course with the Bible Project, you get right at one of the biggest questions people have about Exodus, or something they get snagged on a lot. The early chapters deal with Moses and God delivering his people from slavery in Egypt through Moses, and that the plagues that come down on Egypt are central to that narrative. And one of the reoccurring motifs is that a bad plague is inflicted upon Egypt. Pharaoh decides, okay, I've had enough. I'm going to let the people go. And then we read repeatedly that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And he changes his mind and says, nope, I'm not going to let him go. How are we to understand that idea of Pharaoh's heart being hardened and God being the one who does that? It seems to contradict what a lot of us in modern Christianity understand about the nature of God. Explain that in the context of Exodus and how we should be reading it.
Yeah, so I think one thing that gets us started off on the wrong foot with this question is that our English translations tend to say harden everywhere when there are actually 3 different Hebrew words that are used to describe the whatever happens to Pharaoh's heart. And harden, a hard heart in English tends to connote cruelty. And so the idea that God would make someone cruel and then punish them for being cruel seems really objectionable. But in fact, there are 3 different words used. There's kashe, hazak, and kavod, or kavad. And so kashe is the maybe traditional word hard, like hard would be a good way to describe it, except that it's not in the sense of cruel, it's in the sense of being resolute. And so Pharaoh, and the text is also complex as far as who is hardening Pharaoh's heart, or who's doing this to Pharaoh's heart. So sometimes Pharaoh acts upon his own heart, and sometimes God does. And so if we can sort of separate these things out, that's part of what I try to do in the course, is separate them out and show the complexities. So for the first 5 plagues, it's Pharaoh who is doing the hardening or the making heavy of his own heart. And for the second set of 5, it's Yahweh doing the acting. So Pharaoh's the one who works first on his own heart. And half the time he's making his heart heavy, which is a different metaphor than making it hard. And if you look at Egyptian imagery, iconography, there's the Egyptian Book of the Dead has a depiction of what happens to somebody after they die. As they travel through the underworld, they imagine that the heart is removed and then weighed on a scale. And if the heart is heavier than a feather, then that indicates that the person was guilty of injustice during their lifetime. So a heavy heart is actually a way of saying that someone was guilty of injustice. And this is what Pharaoh does to himself. He makes himself guilty of injustice by refusing to listen to Yahweh, the message through Moses. And then in the second set of plagues, what God's doing is making Pharaoh's heart chazak, which is to say he's strengthening it, so that what Pharaoh has already freely decided to do, Yahweh is saying, yeah, keep at it, giving him a sense of perseverance in what he has decided to do. So this helps me because I don't think God is circumventing Pharaoh's free will and forcing him to be something that he's not. He's actually saying, okay, Pharaoh has asked for a showdown. He said, who's Yahweh? Who's this Yahweh, and why should I have to listen to him? So the plan for the plague narratives is Yahweh to demonstrate who he is. And for him to do that fully, he needs a sparring partner who's going to stay in the game till the end. And so that sparring partner is Pharaoh, who's already decided to oppose Yahweh. And God basically says, keep at it until I've fully demonstrated my glory to the Egyptians and to the Israelites. So it's more complex than just becoming hard-hearted.
I mean, that highlights the dangers and complexities of translation. And sometimes we need to dig deeper than just what our English translations offer us. And even when translated more accurately into English, like a heavy heart, that idiom in English means something very, very different.
Right.
It means sorrowful or grieving, whereas
Right.
in the Egyptian context, as you put it, a heavy heart is one that is burdened by evil and injustice.
Yes.
That is immensely clarifying. Thank you. Okay, so part of my reading up on you was that you did your dissertation on the issue of, in the Ten Commandments, later in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, one of the Ten Commandments were commanded to not take the Lord's name in vain.
Right.
Popularly, this is taught to children in Sunday school and even adults as don't flippantly use God's name in coarse conversation. Don't say Jesus Christ as an insult, or don't say, oh,
Right.
God, as an expletive.
Yeah.
How should we understand that command? What does it mean to actually take the Lord's name in vain?
Yeah, this command, I think, is really widely misunderstood, and it's well-meaning. I think translators have come to this sentence in Exodus 20, verse 7, and they've read in Hebrew, "You shall not lift up or carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain." And they said, well, we don't carry names. Names are something we say, so this must be an idiom or figure of speech for speaking God's name. But my investigation of this command in its literary, historical, and theological context convinced me that that's not what's going on, that this is not a speech-related command, but that, in fact, at Sinai, what's happening is Yahweh is claiming the people as his own people. And so it's as if he's putting his name on them. He proclaims his name over them as if to say, you belong to me. So they now bear his name, just like if I wanted to indicate that something here in my office was mine, like say, this is my Bible, I could write on the cover, Carmen, and then you'd know this is mine. At Sinai, God is putting his name on the people to say, you are mine. And so then the command would be, you belong to me, so don't go out and misrepresent me among the nations. It's much broader than just how we speak God's name. And there's all sorts of evidence in the literary context for this. Just a few chapters later, we have the instructions given for what the high priest will wear. And he has on his chest a pouch with 12 gemstones on it, and each gemstone is inscribed with one of the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it says in Exodus 28:29, so he shall bear the names of the sons of Israel before me. And it's the same phrase, bear the name, as you get in Exodus 20, verse 7. So he's literally carrying names on his person, but he is functioning, I would argue, as a visual model of what's true of every Israelite. We learn in Exodus 19, verse 6, that God calls them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So their status collectively as a kingdom of priests means we could look to the priest to find out how they're supposed to function or who they are.
So, okay, two things. One is there any link here or echo of Genesis 1, where the man and the woman are created in the image of God with the understanding that they exist to represent him, and their faithfulness or unfaithfulness in that task is what ultimately leads them to, be expelled from the garden because they rebel against. Is that an echo here that to bear the name of Yahweh or to represent him is what's really being commanded?
If it's an analogous moment. I think you're right in seeing a connection between the two. They're not the same thing, though. So I would describe it as every human being is the image of God. And I take image to also be a representative role, or to imply a representative role. So humanity, as you have already said, represents God's rule over creation. So that's similar, but it pertains to every human being. Whereas at Sinai, God is selecting a subset of humanity to be his covenant people and to enter into this special relationship with him. He also says in Exodus 19, 5 and 6, that they're his treasured possession, which is, he says, all the nations belong to me, but out of all nations, I've selected you to be my treasured possession. So it's both are an elected role. God's choosing humans to represent him, and then he's choosing Israel to represent him to humanity. But the choosing of Israel is a narrower subset, and then both are representative.
So this language from Exodus is echoed in is it 1 Peter 2, I think, where he talks about the church as being a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a
Yes.
chosen people.
Yes.
So would the application here be to not take the Lord's name in vain means if we are going to call ourselves, or if he calls us as his people, it's a command against hypocrisy, basically. Like we need to
absolutely
accurately represent who he is. And so
Yes.
it's much more a command against not fulfilling our representative role as his people. Is that right?
Exactly. And I wrote my master's thesis on 1 Peter 2, 9, and 10 and studied this kind of connection between the church, because Peter is writing to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles. Right. And yet he's applying to them the covenant titles from Exodus 19. He calls them God's treasured possession, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And so those titles, which only applied to Israel in the Old Testament, are now being applied to the church, to a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles. And that's why I would argue that as Christians, if we want to understand our identity and vocation, we have to go back to Sinai, because that's where those terms are defined. And that's where the marching orders are given, if you will. The 10 Commandments are not just, here are ways to be moral people. The commands God gives at Sinai are fleshing out how to live as his people among the nations, so that when others watch the Israelites, they're going to find out what God is like. And that vocation, that mission is transferred to the church, or maybe let me say it better this way. The church is then included in that mission in the New Testament. We don't replace Israel, but we're
grafted
included,
in, as Paul would say.
We're grafted in, yes, to this mission of representing God to the nations. And so their mission becomes our mission. And so it matters very much. The subtitle to my book on this topic is Why Sinai Still Matters. So I very much think that we need to pay attention to what's happening at Sinai. And without it, we're not going to understand why we're here.
Okay, to that end, talking about the mission that God gives his people at Sinai and in Exodus, when we think of the book of Exodus, we think about Moses, we think about the plagues, we think about the parting of the sea, we think about the 10 Commandments and all those amazing narratives, the golden calf story. But a big chunk of this book is detailed instructions about the construction of the tabernacle. Why should we care about all of those details about embroidered curtains and beams of cedar and all the other intricacies that go? It seems like when I read through the book of Exodus, I kind of get to those chapters. I'm like, yeah. And I flip through them. Why is that so important in the context of the ancient culture that composed this book, and why and how does it apply to us today?
Yeah. So there's several levels on which they're important. Just kind of from the get-go, the amount of time that the text spends on something is a signal to how much weight the author is giving it. And so we shouldn't just gloss over the tabernacle chapters, even if they don't seem immediately relevant to us, because clearly this was important to the Israelites. I think if we see Exodus as the answer to the problems of Genesis, this can go some way to helping us understand it. So in Genesis 1, God creates this beautiful and good world. And in Genesis 2, we get the story of the garden, and Adam and Eve are in the garden and they're fellowshipping with God. They're living in God's presence. But then, as you know, Genesis 3, they rebel against God's command and they lose the access that they had to God's presence because they're kicked out of the garden. And so when God raises up Abraham in Genesis 12 and selects his family to represent him to the nations, it's resolving, the goal is to resolve this problem of alienation from God. And so when we get to Exodus, I would call Exodus a creation story where God is creating a nation. And there are all kinds of echoes of Genesis in the book of Exodus. And this is especially true in the tabernacle instructions. The way the tabernacle is constructed mimics the construction of the world in Genesis.
Right.
And God is reestablishing his presence among his people. He's coming to live with them again, and he's doing so in a way that takes into consideration their sin and their need for forgiveness. So there's barriers so that somebody doesn't accidentally stumble into the presence of God and get zapped because it's dangerous to be that close to God. But he wants to be in the midst of their community.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you bring that up because I think we carry a cultural assumption for whatever reason that the tabernacle and all its barriers and prohibitions are all a way of God basically saying, you disgusting creatures can't come near me. I don't want you near me. But the way you just framed it was all these barriers and rituals and protections are put there for our sake.
Yes.
Because God is
Absolutely.
concerned about our preservation, not his purity.
Right.
And that's a very different way of thinking about it. It's a far more hospitable and gracious way of thinking about it.
It is. And it's an amazing story because when the people arrive at Sinai, they see this dramatic revelation of God's presence on top of the mountain. There's lightning and thunder, and they hear the voice of God speaking from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. But then it's not as though they're like, okay, now that we've met God, we're going to go on our way. God says, I want to come with you. And there's a complex narrative around sort of negotiating that, because there's one point at the golden calf at which God says, I better not come with you because I might destroy you on the way. Like, you're so rebellious that this is not going to be pretty. And Moses is like, I am not taking another step if it takes me away from your presence. I would rather live the rest of my life at this mountain than leave without you. He says, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. This is in Exodus 33 and 34. And God says, okay, I will come with you. And that conversation is framed by the tabernacle instructions on the one hand and the fulfillment of those instructions, the actual building of the tabernacle. So it makes this wonderful literary sandwich around Israel's sin that tells me God anticipated Israel's sin and he made a plan for being able to safely go with them forward so that Sinai does not become a place of pilgrimage for the Israelites. They don't go back there in the future repeatedly to try to access the presence of God, because God has said, no, I want to live with you. I will walk among you and be your God. And that's a restoration of what had been lost in the garden. So it's beautifully good news that God wants to be with his people, and that he made a way to do so.
I want to go back to the golden calf story in a minute, but before we leave the tabernacle idea, it's obviously central to understanding the Torah and the Old Testament story and Israel. How does understanding the tabernacle and its construction in Exodus illuminate the New Testament for us? I'm thinking both about 1 Peter again, where he uses temple imagery in that same chapter of living stones and things like that.
Yeah.
But even, we're in the Advent season and we think about the incarnation of Jesus, and John uses tabernacle language.
He does.
In his opening chapter of the gospel. So how should a Christian without perhaps a deep knowledge of Old Testament theology understand the importance of tabernacle as they read the New Testament?
Yeah, the presence of God coming among his people was dramatic in Exodus, but it wasn't complete. When Moses is up on the mountain and he asks to see God's glory, God says, okay, I'll let you see my back. And so he hides Moses in the cleft of a rock and he passes by, and then he lets Moses get a glimpse of his back, whatever that means.
Right.
And so there's a sense in which they've come close to the presence of God, but they can't look God full in the face. And then Jesus comes, and Jesus is God made flesh, and he looks people in the face. At the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah appear and commune with Jesus. And it's as if the unfinished business of the Old Testament is being finished, because Moses and Elijah are the two men who went up Sinai and saw God's back. And now they get to go back up a mountain and see God's face in the face of Jesus. And so I think that the tabernacle prefigures Christ in that it demonstrates God's commitment to being with his people, but it's still in a sort of tentative way in that people can't have a face-to-face encounter with God safely because of their own sin. And so when Christ comes and he cleanses us from sin, he makes it possible for us to enter fully into God's presence. And he then is that presence. So the tabernacle or the temple becomes unnecessary because we have God himself among us. We don't need a place to go to have that mediated experience. And then, as you pointed out, in Peter describes the church as the temple, that we are built together as living stones for the presence of God. So there's a sense in which the church gathered becomes the means by which God makes his presence known to the world, which is just beautiful.
Yeah, and Paul picks up that theme too, is it's in Ephesians 2. He talks about we are all being constructed together into a living temple, and with Christ Jesus himself as a cornerstone. All these images that come out of the Old Testament and Exodus especially. Okay, let's go back to that golden calf story. And I mean, we could spend all day talking about that one. So when I mentioned the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, that story is sometimes used by people of a Reformed or Calvinist bent to argue for predestination. Like Pharaoh was predetermined to be, an enemy of God, and it's just how it is. And sometimes that same school of thought struggles with the golden calf story because of what you mentioned earlier, where the Lord says, I'm out of here. I'm not going to stay with these people because it's going to be too dangerous. And Moses intercedes and says, no, you please, don't leave us. And it appears like the Lord changes his mind. And sometimes people with a very high view of God's sovereignty go, well, how does that work? Because how can a human like Moses change God's mind? In the literary context of Exodus, how should we understand that golden calf story and what's going on there between Moses and Yahweh in determining his actions?
Yeah, so the word in Hebrew is the same word that's everywhere else translated repented. In Exodus 32:14, it says, then Yahweh repented and did not bring on his people the disaster he threatened. So I'm changing the NIV says relented, but it's the same word for repent. And to even suggest that God repented is shocking to many readers because, wait, I thought God was sinless, and God is sinless. But if we understand repentance as a changing of direction, so you're headed one way, and to repent is to turn around and walk the other direction. So there are probably two main ways of explaining what's going on in Exodus 32. One is to say that God is testing Moses to find out if Moses shares his sense of compassion. So God says he's going to destroy them, but he's not really going to destroy them. He's just trying to provoke Moses to intercede and put himself in that place of, he has an opportunity in chapter 32 because God says, how about I destroy everybody and start over with you, and I'll make you into a new nation.
Right.
I mean, that's a pretty attractive offer if you're Moses. Like, all these people who've been rebellious in the wilderness are going to be gone, and you are going to be, king, and your family is going to all serve me. And Moses won't take the bait. So one view is that this is not God's actual intent. He's just testing Moses. Moses comes through with genuine intercession and says, no, I'm not interested in you destroying the people. He's more concerned about Yahweh's reputation among those, especially the Egyptians. Like, he says, why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? He's recognizing God's reputation as at stake. So one group would say God wasn't actually going to destroy them. This was just a test, and Moses passes the test. Another view is that no, God actually was within his rights. It was consistent with his character to bring destruction on these people because they had violated his commands. They had rebelled against him, so he could have destroyed them. And Moses actually changes God's mind by saying, no, let's persevere because your reputation is at stake, and show your mercy instead of your wrath. And God says, all right, I'm on board with that. So those are the two views. And again, those who are coming from a more Calvinist bent, where there's just a very high view of God's sovereignty, do struggle with this passage because it seems like God is announcing something that he doesn't really think then.
It does seem consistent, though, with other Torah narratives. I'm thinking about the Lord interacting with Abraham around Sodom and Gomorrah. And, can you find 100 righteous people? Can you find 10 righteous people? Like there's the negotiation of somebody who is intimately connected with the Lord. It's really bizarre in our theological framework. We just don't have a lot of room for that. And yet it seems to be the plain reading of these texts make it sound like Moses did change or was a critical component in changing God's mind.
Yes.
And maybe there's just a mystery there that we're left with these two ways of interpreting it, and you go, "What do you do?" But what I'm picking up is you're not saying there's a definitive right answer to this interpretation found in the text itself.
I mean, you can make the case in either direction. As you've said, Sky, the plain reading of the text is that God determined to do something, Moses interceded, and God changed his mind. And if I lean towards reading it that way, just at face value. And if I do, it is tremendously encouraging to me that, encouraging and terrifying that we actually could change God's mind through prayer, that prayer actually matters, and that leadership, the intercession of leaders on behalf of the people really matters. That events are not all predetermined and they're just unfolding according to a predetermined plan, but that God is entering into a relationship with humanity that is dynamic and responsive. I see that, as you said, not just here, but throughout the Bible. I see it in the Psalms. I see it with Abraham. I see God speaking through the prophets in such a way so as to take into consideration the responses of people. Jeremiah 18 talks about if at any time I announce that a nation's going to be destroyed and that nation repents, then I won't destroy it. So there's a sense in which our response to God actually changes things. That seems to me the plainest reading of the text.
Yeah, it feels like we tend to fall on one side or the other in error. One extreme being the immutability of God, his absolute sovereignty and unchangeability. The other extreme is open theism. Say, well, God doesn't actually know what's going to happen, and therefore, the future can be changed by our actions. And somewhere in the middle is this greater mystery of how does human will and divine sovereignty interact with each other? I don't know, but I agree with you. Like when I read scripture, I see that human action, intercession, prayer matters. I don't know exactly how that works, but the Exodus is full of it. The Torah is full of it. Yeah. Before we go, just a final plug. Your course on Exodus on the BibleProject website, it's 14 hours of content. It's a lot of content, and it's free. Like anyone can access it for free. I shouldn't say it's free. Others have paid for it.
Yes, right? That's right.
Others have donated and given to this ministry to make it available to all of the rest of us for free. Relatively succinctly, what do you hope somebody gets from those 14 hours if they invest that time with you in learning about Exodus?
Yeah, I hope that people walk away with a glittering vision of what an important book Exodus is theologically and how brilliantly it is constructed. I spend quite a bit of time on literary design as well as theological themes. So thinking through like how are the plagues structured? If you are watching the video version of this, you can see the back of my office door has all kinds of papers taped to it. And this was my attempt to sort of sort out the plagues and to identify literary patterning between them and how they're told. And so they work in like columns and rows. It's fascinating. And so that's one of the things I talk about in the course. I hope people walk away with the sense that God is not working haphazardly, but that his plan is good and just, and that the telling about that plan in Exodus is endlessly fascinating, that there's so much to see if we're willing to slow down and read carefully. It's not the final word on Exodus. There's so much more to be said. 14 hours barely scratches the surface, but it's I hope it's a teaser that will make people want to read more.
Well, I do. And as we started out with, Exodus is so critical for understanding the entire Bible, Old and New Testaments. And I'd encourage anybody, if part of your New Year's resolutions is to understand and read the Bible better, this would be a great way to begin. And thank you so much for putting the time and energy into creating that course for us. Thank you for being here. And I hope you'll come back and we can talk and geek out a little bit more on some stuff. We've barely scratched the surface
We have.
on Old Testament questions. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.